Welcome to this whirlwind tour of the history of the Guatemalan Foundation, previously known as the Foundation for Indian Development. I'm Cordell Anderson, your narrator. It all started in 1958 when I was a missionary in Guatemala. I came to love deeply the people and witness firsthand their extreme suffering. An idea came to me I felt could solve their problems, which became known as the philosophy and principles of the good life. I felt that I had to return to Guatemala and do what I could, so for the next 9 years I prepared myself and my family, making a number of exploratory trips, and then in the Henry Mountains of southern Utah I experienced the kind of spiritual rebirth through which the Lord gave me the courage to make the move. So in 1967 I announced to my father, with whom I worked in a family business, that I would be leaving in 4 months, but I promised to put together a 2-year supply of samplers so he could continue alone. I achieved that goal, packed up with my family, and headed to my parents' home in Provo, Utah to say goodbye. There, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Canna, came out laughingly saying, "I'll give you 6 months and you'll come running home with your tail between your legs." We headed south, traveling through Mexico, seeing heavily loaded vehicles like ours that was 2,000 pounds overloaded. But we made it to Guatemala, the land of eternal spring, the land of the Mayas, and a land of great contrast, as we note passing through Guatemala City. Then on to our destination, 10 hours and 120 miles into the remote Alta Verapaz area and the town of Coban that had a general store, a hospital, one dentist, and a small LDS congregation. I settled the family in a rental home and started the first project, a traveling movie called Cine Chapinlandia, visiting 6 of the most isolated towns in the country, showing educational and feature-length movies to 50,000 people over the next 6 months. We called it our private family Peace Corps. But it wasn't profitable enough to support us, so before our initial capital of $4,272 ran out, we acquired a small property and established there the first commercial poultry farm, albeit very small, in northern Guatemala. We had one employee, Manuela Hanel, who had an extreme alcoholism problem, but we were finally supporting ourselves with laying hens and 19 head of cattle. My parents had been extremely supportive and made their first trip to visit, along with my sister Jolene and brother Howard. Mom is here in front of the small farm home, and you see Dad here helping me with the laying hens. The front room of our rental home in Coban became a store to sell our eggs. Then, quite miraculously, we acquired the 600-acre Valparaiso plantation you see a portion of, revealing mounds where ancient Mayan buildings had hauntingly turned into ruins. Drunkenness was an epidemic among our 240 resident Mayan Pocomchi Indians. The other ruin was the haunted central house where I had to stay in the beginning as the family was still in Coban. I was fortunate to have appear my first student and companion, Miguel Angel Ortiz, who in a year learned to drive, work with cattle, poultry, and the people, and became the manager. None of the 39 homes had an outhouse and were literally incubators for disease and death. There were sick and dying in every thatch hut. My daughter Julie and I began trying to save all we could. We lost this woman and were then given her son Tomas, who we couldn't save either, but for him we had the first religious service. I then helped the father dig the burial hole. It was the first time the Indians had seen a landowner concerned for one of them. By this time the family had joined me at Valparaiso. It was an epidemic, killing thousands in the area. Tomas's father then brought his sons Alfonso and Leek to the central house, begging us to keep them alive. That began an avalanche of needy coming to us, and the family grew. Eventually called the mob by critical visitors from the U.S., but this was the key to our success, symbolized by this photograph printed in an LDS publication captioned erroneously, "3 little Indian boys," but they were rather my 2 sons with their Indian brother Ruben in the middle, arm in arm as brothers. The first law was, if you want to eat, you have to work. So we all went to work, old and young. We continued employing the 39 men working the sugarcane. Then we put others clearing a swamp and creating a lake for recreation and fishing. Mechanization started with a Honda diesel garden cultivator. By this time we had sold the poultry farm, and Manuel begged us to take them with us. So here he is tilling the land for the first time. He also took charge of the poultry, and we began teaching many young men as vocational students. This also provided work and learning experience for the young ladies dressing the broiler chickens. Others worked with laying hens. Then we found a grandma struggling to keep her children and grandchildren alive. The youngest, sucking at her dry breast, was Miguelito. I adopted them, ate with them a couple of times a week, but eventually to save Miguelito we had to take him to the central house. He was dying until I got a half-pound of roundworms out of him, you see on the upper right. He developed quickly as part of our family, and at 10 was adopted and grew up in Heber, Utah. From there, he later returned to Guatemala as an LDS missionary, the first born at Valparaiso. Then, out of a general intestinal parasite treatment for 160 and a movie afterwards, evolved the miracle of Elvira, restored to life after dying. This is her a few years later, as eventually she lived in the central house with her mother and sister. With her miracle, the word spread like wildfire that there was something going on at Valparaiso that should be trusted. Soon came an invitation from the Nakitob village, 2 miles up a slippery trail to the south. We got there too late to save this little child, but then visited the government school with 15 little boys attending, no girls. We began helping the village long term, as you will see. The Central House family was doing better. Remodeling and new paint had the ghosts go away. Us Andersons would begin our day at 6 a.m. with what we called a devotional, studying, praying, and then having breakfast together. Each evening, the whole Central House family would all get together to read, sing, sometimes see a movie, and pray. For years, there were 50 of us, so we had to eat in shifts. Florencia Rivas, for years, was the Central House supervisor. Education, of course, was a top priority. The first class was with my employees after work. Julie then started teaching the children when she was 10 years old. Then we employed a teacher and formally established a private school authorized by the government. Many cured patients relapsed, so we began preventive classes teaching them about the invisible world of microbes that cause bad odors, rot, and sickness. We grew them in petri dishes and showed them with an old microscope, and they began taking clean seriously. Soon the first outhouse hole was dug and we went into production building floors and box seats. By the end of that year, every home had an outhouse and death stopped for 3 years. Homes were improved, this one with a large outhouse and a very nice, clean and stimulating interior. We then devised a unique way to teach the importance of nutrition. My parents became convinced they had to do more. Dad sold the family business and in December 1969 with a few friends organized the Foundation for Indian Development. In addition to being the major contributor, he managed it as a non-paid volunteer for the last 14 years of his life. For him, this was living his religion, dedicating everything he had to what he considered the work of the Lord. He often quoted the scripture, "Men should be engaged in a good cause of their own free will, but he that doeth not anything until he is commanded, the same is damned." For us, it was reaching out to the Lord's little ones who were out of reach of governments, churches, and charitable institutions. The first project of the foundation was to get a Ford tractor with implements to enhance the work projects that were teaching laboratories for the growing group of young men from all over the country. Daniel Choc, an impressive barefoot 15-year-old from Patesia, was chosen as the first to learn how to operate the tractor. He thereafter was made the tractor supervisor, and in the next 2 years taught 26 other youth what he knew. Daniel suggested that the best way to help his people would be to formalize the program and give many youth the chance to learn correct principles and become productive Guatemalans. So the plantation became known as the Center for Indian Development, the CID. This was the vocational education program dubbed Learning with a Shovel, or a Chainsaw, a Fishnet, or a Tractor. They each studied half a day in the school, then worked half a day on a rotation basis, getting 1 month's experience in each of the work projects. Like the poultry project we have already seen, and others flashing on the screen, too numerous to explain in detail. The dairy was a big development with 5 areas of employment and training for the youth. It evolved to become the best dairy with the champion producer, 12 gallons of milk in 1 day, and the grand champion Jersey cows of all Central America. The students continue getting wide experience in all aspects of work, including the shop and construction projects. Hal Polson, his wife Neva, and daughter Jeannie spent 6 months helping, leaving the welder, other tools, a homemade trailer, and his ex-post office vehicle, and constructing an experimental earthquake-proof healthy home. The home improvement program was ongoing until all lived in a healthy home. The students were given an opportunity to work in the office, learning how to run a business. Several of them eventually became plantation and dairy managers. One student was trained as a dental technician and later was helped to establish his own dental clinic in Patsun. All received some training in emergency medical treatment. Two became paramedics, manning the clinic and making trips into the mountains on horseback, where they forged partnerships with many villages where we built schools and helped in all kinds of community developments. One was the first school rebuilt and functioning after the 1976 earthquake that killed 23,000 Guatemalans. Other projects went forward in isolated areas like the Chulac Cooperative Plantation, and in the Saxuha Church of the Prince of Peace they had the largest rural Protestant congregation in Guatemala. We even had a project on the shores of Lake Coatepec in El Salvador with these poor children. We helped all get an education. The Naquitob Village School above Valparaiso continually received our attention, and by 1980 was a nice school with 50 children attending, including many girls. The Valparaiso School had grown to having all 6 grades with 110 students. Our students participating in the 1980 Departmental Fair Parade and receiving their first place award from Guatemala's president. Leading the parade was our soccer team called the Lamanite Youth that were the regional champions, winning one of the most astounding championship tournaments of my experience. In 9 games, we won 38-3. Us Andersons were also growing in numbers, the older helping tutor the younger in their English correspondence courses and helping in all aspects of the work. But in mid-1981, the guerrilla war invaded Alta Verapaz big time, and the family was moved back to Provo, Utah. The Valparaiso SID had to close, and many shifts were made. I kept the business and projects alive during this dangerous period, spending 2 months in Guatemala, then 2 months in the U.S., and until 1988 made 54 round trips to keep everything going. For the education of the children in the Valparaiso area, a school was constructed and inaugurated with the Guatemalan Army protecting the perimeter against guerrilla attacks. By this time, the Valparaiso community had also been established, each of the families living on their own land and in homes we helped them build. The foundation work shifted at that time to the Patsisia area, where I helped the Ayuda organization working with members of a credit co-op they had organized. I began teaching them and their children the philosophy and principles of the good life and helped 35 of their children get into school. We also took charge of Ayuda's projects in Cunin. Soon, the Ayuda organization disappeared, and we kept alive the projects in Cunin for 10 years. Back in Patsisia, a friend, Domingo Soloman, introduced me to the John Paul II School, a school with a Catholic name, supported by a Protestant organization, World Vision, and run by Mormons. World Vision soon exited and we took over, eventually helping them construct their own building, at which time they changed the name. The school, with its 200 to 250 students, is unique in that all students learn in an environment with no religious or ethnic discrimination. Since 1982, this has been the main project of the foundation with astounding results. In 1983, we suffered a great loss with the passing of my father, and 3 years later, my mother. At Mom's funeral, $20,000 was raised for a special project in their honor in Guatemala. A school was built in the very poor rural village of Chuluc, 5 miles outside of Patsisia. In 1987, the school was inaugurated with a bunch of Andersons present. Since then, the foundation has persisted in helping the school, paying the wage of one of the teachers, and helping in many other ways. By 1984, I was able to return to Valparaiso. We started a preschool to prepare the little ones for attending this public school and organize other community projects. We helped with more additions to the Valparaiso school and had many projects in the villages. Crises always ambush us from time to time. my Toyota pickup you see here was carjacked at gunpoint. The guerrilla war persisted and we had to be armed, forming civil defense patrols for the area. There was also the criminal element masquerading as guerrillas. Eventually there was one dangerous ambush, and then, later on, a furious fight with gangbangers on Guatemala's 6th Avenue. We won, by the way. In 1991, parents from the isolated Chula Cooperative Plantation again asked for our help. So we went to work helping them build and operate 2 schools. Over the years, 70 round trips were made to this isolated area with Foundation 4-wheel drive vehicles. By the end of 1993, circumstances sadly made necessary selling the Valparaiso plantation. We hauled a Mayan altar from there to our new 18-acre farm. In the entrance, I built the Museum of the Holy Man. This referred to a Pocumchi legend of a bearded white creator god who had visited them and taught them anciently. In addition to my own children, 2 more girls were added over the years. Aura was the first, given to me on Christmas Eve 1984 when 15 months old and dying. Here's the story of this beautiful daughter in pictures. Then in 1991, a mother in the Valparaiso area died giving birth, and I was given another baby to raise. I named her Mahana, who you see in this montage. The last image is of her graduating from Springville High School on May 24th, 2011. As a single parent, I legally adopted both of them in 1996. During those years, we continued with all our projects in the country, including additional help for our brothers and sisters in the Valparaiso community, including a near-death experience helping with their electric installation, and which opened up many possibilities for them. The Valparaiso School, of course, had grown more, and an additional building with 3 classrooms was constructed. Then in 2001, Chapina, another of the many dying we took in, saved and raised in the central house, gave birth to David. But it went badly, and she was expected to die in the hospital. She wanted me to have David. For the next month, he slept by my side, and it looked like I would remain in Guatemala to raise another child. But again the miracle happened, and Chapina recovered. They live in Cuban, where she supports herself with her business selling used American clothes. My daughter, Aura, lives with her, finishing her university studies as a social worker. By 2002, I decided that it was perhaps time to return to the U.S., with my tail between my legs, as predicted by Sister Cannon in 1967. Great Guatemalans were now supervising most of the projects, and they could do it much more safely than me. Professor Federico Bellis is doing a great job managing the projects in the Alta Verapaz area as a volunteer. For example, just in the past year, he and the foundation helped the Valparaiso School become even a more amazing story by establishing there in the afternoon a junior high school with teenagers attending from 8 different villages that surround the area. We continue to help the Nakitop village, now with over 400 students. Do you remember the dirt forge school in the beginning? There were no girls. Many of the success stories and projects are attributable to Federico and his dedication. The schools in Patricia and projects in the Central Highlands are supervised by Professor Humberto Chicay, another dedicated Guatemalan who we have worked with since 1982. We are doing our darndest, helping suffering children who have little or no hope turn into happy, healthy, educated, and successful Guatemalans like Moncho, who grew up in the Central House, who we see here today with his large family in front of their home in the Valparaiso community. Up on the hill above his home, overlooking the valley, is the LDS chapel where the new generation has taken charge. Recently, leaders asked me to help them understand their history and where they came from. So I put together a 43-page photographic history. They invited the community to a fireside where it was shown to them with a digital projector. They all send their greetings and thanks, now knowing that nearly every family in the community has a father, mother, or both, or grandparents who were saved in those first years, without which the community wouldn't exist. Do you recall my first employee, Manuel, at the poultry farm, who was a serious drunk who followed us to Valparaiso? Afterwards, he should have died in a brooder room when a propane gas explosion shot him out of the room like a cannonball, and he became seriously disfigured. Here he is today, 40 years later, with his wife Julia, as the patriarch of the Coban LDS stake. Remember the dirty little boy named Lake, who with his brother were turned over to the central house to keep him alive? Here he is receiving his degree as a certified public accountant, and that's just one of many such stories, one being the miracle baby Elvira we see here with her first child. We could tell you similar stories from Patsisia with poor children who we helped get an education, becoming doctors, lawyers, hundreds becoming policemen, health workers, teachers, 8 becoming Catholic priests, one today a special envoy at the Vatican, and others becoming missionaries like Daniel Choc, the first caciquel for the LDS Church, and so far 1 bishop and 1 mayor. Many more such stories could be told, but suffice it to say, this is what we do. Please help us do more.